right now on Higher Journeys Radio with Alexis Brooks. The human experience. How is it connected to non-human intelligence? Moreover, how can we, living in a world of postmodernism, synthesize our focus on the bigger picture, bringing together the nuts and bolts left brain with the more consciousness and intuitively focused right-brained aspects of this broad and mysterious phenomenon? Said another way, can we bridge the mechanistic and the experiential when it comes to the ET and UFO phenomenon? To broach this big question, I turned to UFO researcher and experiencer Mike Clelland to help us parse this all out. Though we both agree that the field of ufology is in part a scientific study of phenomena, there is a subjective and personal aspect that cannot and should not be ignored. Let's tune in to this provocative and thoughtful discussion. Well, Mike, at this point, you and I have had quite a few phone conversations since we initially met back in 2016 in Maine for an experiencer conference. And in our last chat, just a few days ago, we were both musing about the disparity in dialogue or position when it comes to two very distinct sides within the field of UFO research. Now, to start, this term that we have, that being UFO, which has been used to describe an area of interest that is so broad, so multifaceted, and yet, bless our hearts, us humans love to simplify things, including using labels like UFO, when there's so much more to this phenomenon than mere unidentified flying objects, or these days we say UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. So today, I thought we'd have a dialogue about the two vastly different sides to this broad phenomenon when it comes to where importance is placed. We're talking about the mechanistic, material, technological aspect of the ET and UFO phenomenon, including the cover-ups, the leaks, the secret programs, etc., the who knows what and for how long, as compared to the experiential part of this big mystery. This involves us, perhaps many of us, the contact with non-human intelligence, abduction scenarios, and even the prospect of ET-human hybrids walking amongst us. And yes, the consciousness aspect, of which many agree play a central part in this big mystery. So, now that we've set the stage for this great discussion we're going to have, let me finally and formally welcome you to Higher Journeys for the very first time. Mike Clelland, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Glad you're here. Now, for the record, to the audience, both Mike and I, as researchers, have been clear that our entry point into this work is based on the experiencer aspect. I mean, I've said many times, the more mechanistic aspects to this field have never fully held my interest. And when I started to look at the level of interaction that we as humans may be having with non-human beings, things started to get very interesting for me, and they have remained so to this day. Now, Michael, I just realized I called you Michael. Do you go by Michael or?
I usually go by Mike. Okay. If my mom was mad at me, she would call me Mike.
Well, I'm not mad at you, but I said Michael for the record. I'm going to say Mike.
That's okay.
Forgive me, Mike. Listen, I know that you, as an experiencer yourself, feel the same way as I in terms of this entry point. You've done some stellar research into this aspect based on your own sojourns into this mystery. So before we get into the crux of the discussion, I would love for you to give us a little thumbnail as to your specific entry point and when this all began for you. What brought you into this?
So if folks don't know who I am, there's like one key factor here, then it's the owl. So I recognize fully that I am now known as the owl guy. And I have no problem with that. And it's true. I have done a wealth of research into owls and their connections to both UFO contact and synchronicities, and then a whole host of other things, including shamanism and death and meditation and a few other like sort of more what I use the term of the highly charged human experience. Mm-hmm. So those kind of events in people's lives. Now, so turn the clock back to 2006, which is 13 years ago. I was 44 at the time, And I was living out west, and I had a lifetime of these kind of odd little events that I somehow managed to ignore and deny and not confront. I had seen close-up UFO, well, one very close-up UFO, and then another odd light in the sky. I had a missing time experience. And then there was even a point when I woke up in the middle of the night and looked out my window, and there was a bright light shining in, and I looked out, and just outside the window, pretty darn close to the house, were five spindly gray aliens in little tight kind of uniforms. And I without any emotion at all, I sort of heard a voice in my head that says, "Oh yes, they're here. Now is the time to put your head on the pillow and shut down." And that's exactly what I did. So it was a scary thing to see, but I didn't react like I was frightened. Now, so I had all those memories. I dismissed them all. I denied them all. I figured out a way to not take them seriously. In 2006, it really started happening fast and furious. And this was at a point when I was like, I recognized that I was avoiding the subject. I was actually reading UFO books somewhat compulsively at that time, but I was not factoring in my own experience. I wasn't going to go there. And that changed in 2006 when I went camping and with a stranger. It was kind of a remarkable thing, just someone I had never, which is kind of something you could do in a town like I lived in. It was a town out west, a small little town. It had a real strong camping culture, and that's just what people did, So instead of, going to the movie or something like that, you would go camping. So, and her name was Kristen, this friend who I really didn't know, and we went out for one night, and the weather was beautiful, and we didn't take a shelter. We were going to just sleep out under the stars. I was living right near Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Park. I was on the Idaho side of the range there, and the sun was setting, and we were in this field of wildflowers, and it was really lovely. And I was on a big flat rock making dinner, and an owl flew over us, and then another owl, and then a third owl, and we laid down on our sleeping bags, and these owls swooped above us, just right above, blotted out the stars for just a second. They're very quiet in flight, so there's nothing to hear. And it was really magical. And then a few days later, we just went out for one night. We went back, and a few days later, I said, "Hey, let's go out another time. Let's go out camping again." This time, the weather was a little colder, and it was a little chillier. And I said, "Let's walk up to the top of that hill." Well, this time we had a tent with us. Let's walk up to the top of that hill and get warm, because it could be, we need just generate. We were just kind of sitting still. It was kind of chilly. So there was this little hill we're kind of in the high country there. And so we'd watch the sunset from the top of this hill. So we got to the top of this hill, and an owl lands on a branch, an owl flies above us, and an owl lands at our feet. And 4 days earlier, these owls, I'm convinced they were the same three owls. 4 days earlier, they kind of kept their distance. Not this time. They were right next to us. They were at our feet in front of us. And it was really remarkable. To have it happen once was pretty cool. To have it happen twice within 4 days with the same person was absolutely mystical.
Sure.
And in that moment, I had a voice in my head. And it's funny now. I've told this story hundreds of times. And I just recently went back and looked at some of my original notes. But this is what I used to say. I used to say, in the moment, I heard a voice in my head, could have been my own voice, that said, "This has something to do with the UFOs." I was looking at real owls, and I heard a voice that says, "This has something to do with the UFOs." I went back and looked at my original notes just a few weeks ago. And what I actually wrote down at the time, was I was looking at a real owl. The voice in my head said, "This has something to do with the UFOs. You are an abductee."
Wow. Very direct.
Which is a little different. And it's funny that I managed to kind of over the years, just kind of erase that from my little storytelling. But that was there. So I had all these events in my life. I started looking into them. So it wasn't, seeing aliens in the backyard that inspired me to look into these events. It was these owls that inspired me. So consequently, one of the questions I ask every single person I interact with who has some sort of UFO experience or a UFO researcher, I'll say, have you ever had any odd experiences with owls?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not 100%, but it's enough that there is a very clear pattern. And I've collected and archived these stories, and those stories have turned into two big books. And the third big book is more about my own journey. There's certainly owls in that, but it's not the focus as it is with the other two books.
Thank you for that very succinct, and I'm telling you, audience, this draws you in immediately. This whole, now I was debating, Mike, when we decided to do this interview, do we want to focus on, obviously, your stellar research into the owl connection and the UFO experience, or this? And I think that if I'm trying to think of a segue, how we can maybe go from your own personal journey into the bigger picture, what we're going to talk about here. So you have asked the people that you've come in contact with. I know you've documented many, many cases of experiencers and people that have had some form of UFO contact, whether owls have been central or at least a part of the experience. And you're saying that not all, but significantly enough to pique your interest even more and show that there's a connection here. Is that what you're saying? That
yes, it's not central. It's certainly not central to the mystery. It's on the outs. It's an outlying little thing. I would call it a fractal at the edge, right? You're dealing with this little pinpoint fractal at the way on the outside edge. I didn't discover this. Whitley Strieber had written about it, and other people had certainly written about it beforehand. But you would get a big fat UFO book, and in there would be a paragraph on owls or a few sentences. So it was out there. It was not at the center of anyone's research until
you came along.
Until I came along, yeah. Until I came along and kind of went kind of wiggy on it and kind of got completely obsessed.
Right.
And it was actually, honestly, it was really fun. It was really interesting to pick this one topic and then pull on those threads.
Yeah. Well, again, you've just done amazing work, and I know there's still lots to do because the mystery is still somewhat ubiquitous. How can we segue this? Now, I'm going to bring in some names. I'm going to name names today. Why not? And it's all in a positive way. We're going to talk about, for starters, a couple of mutual colleagues, including Rich Dolan, who we both know quite well. I want to bring him in at this point, Mike, because we're talking about, again, two very distinct and yet disparate areas of research in this field we broadly call ufology. Now, you take Richard Dolan, who everyone knows, and he's, again, stellar researcher, historian by profession. He is the pragmatic, the left brain, the most thorough, I would say, one of the most thorough researchers on the more mechanistic aspects of this broad phenomenon. And yet, we were talking about this offline. Richard is also very open to the experiential, although that's not his bailiwick, but he is open to it. Have you had conversations? I know you've worked with him quite closely over the years.
Oh, yeah.
Have you had conversations?
He edited the first book.
Okay. And didn't he write the foreword to one of them as well?
The first one. Oh, yeah.
What did he have to say, coming from the aspect that he is known for in terms of...
Well, he addresses this in the foreword. Like, in the foreword of the book, he basically says, I'm gonna paraphrase the first line of the I could actually read it here or something, but I'm going to paraphrase it. Like, no thinking person will read this book without a fundamental change in his insights into reality. And that was talking about my first book, which is a big fat, it's almost 400 pages, a big fat book on owls and synchronicities and UFOs. And my own story is in there too. So, I've had lots of conversations with him because Rich knew me, I'm much calmer now. Rich knew me at a point when I was really struggling with this stuff. And it was challenging, and Rich and I are almost exactly the same age. And so, we kind of, I feel like somewhat just on a personal level, like he's kind of a equal, well, what would you call it? A peer. He's a peer in that sense. Yeah. So, but the people have asked me this question before, like, how did Rich Dolan get involved in this weird owl stuff? And what I had done is I did a presentation, stood on a stage and did my first presentation in 2014 at the International UFO Congress. And I have to thank Alejandro Rojas for, giving me the chance to do that. And the talk went very well. And I sent Rich a link to like a little online password protected thing where he could look at the video of the talk. And he got right back to me and he says, like, this has to be a book. And I was kind of working on the book at the time, and so he's kind of new. And I said, "Yeah, this you got to really make this book happen." And he was really drawn in by the talk, and so I want to be very careful not to put words into his mouth, but he certainly recognized that there was this strange, mystical consciousness, whatever term you want to use, aspect
Right.
to within the research. And I think he was kind of waiting for a book to come along to publish that would address it in a thoughtful way. And then that turned out to be my book. So he kind of said, "No, I really want to do this." And I said, "This is a big departure for you." And he said, "No, this feels like an important book." And that's part of the reason it was so long. I was like, this it feels like it's getting long. What do I leave out? And we had a long conversation. He's like, "No one has ever addressed this subject. So you sort of need to put it all in there."
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Thank you. Look, I don't want this to be a conversation with an expectation of deciding which aspect of this phenomenon, mechanistic or experiential, is more important, Mike. I do want to get into a discussion about why these areas have heretofore been so distinct and kept separate. And it's clear just by this short story that you told us about your interaction with Richard, says that the people that are heavy on this aspect of the research are still, at least some of them, amenable to this more mystical aspect. But there is clearly, almost silos between the two. Just generally speaking, what are your initial thoughts as to the why on all this? And I think we actually talked about this offline the other day, having to do with male and female, maybe.
Oh yeah, that's my
Just
sense.
leading question.
Right down the line, it is guys and girls. I mean, that's a ridiculous caricature, but there's a bit of truth there. So when I gave that talk in 2014 at the International UFO Congress, like I would go to that conference. I'd been there a bunch of times, and I had gone to a lot of conferences, and some more, nuts and bolts. The terms, two camps, I say love and light and nuts and bolts, and that's that's a little bit provocative, but that's okay. So like I have short hair, and I would dress nice when I went to conferences. I would like wear nice shoes and put on a blazer. And I wouldn't wear a tie or anything like that, but I was, I made an effort to dress nice. Just it seemed like the subject requires a little bit of respect. So I was able to sort of flit like a little honeybee between all the camps.
Mm-hmm.
And then I did a talk, and so I had the little name tag that hangs around your neck, and I had my name, and it said speaker, and everyone could look on the little flyer that lists all the speakers, the schedule, and see that I was the guy who was going to talk about owls, UFOs, and synchronicity. And I was absolutely ostracized from one half of the conference.
That blatant, huh?
Like they wouldn't make eye contact with me. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but it was almost at that point. And obviously, yes, I'm being a little bit bold is how I tell this now that it's a few years ago. But and at the same time, I was immediately like the darling of the Love and Light camp, right? So they were like, "Oh, you're talking about owls. Oh, that's so wonderful. Here, come sit with us and talk with us." And it's a little bit, it's a little bit of a caricature, and it's obviously not 100% true, but the many more women on the Love and Light camp and many more men in the Nuts and Bolts camp, which is true of anything, right? I mean, that's like that's men go to engineering school, and women they become psychologists and psychiatrists and things like that. So in differing numbers. So I was like shocked. I did not expect that.
To be that blatant, you mean, in terms of the alienation? Forgive the pun.
yes, exactly. It's just I was shocked that I would be like, wow, I'm like really, but I made a ton of friends on the other side. So the divide just got like more rigid all of a sudden, right? So I was being sucked into one camp, and I was being ignored by the other camp. So, and what also happened, which I'm happy to say, is a few people in the Nuts and Bolts camp said, "I did not know what to make of your talk at all. Like I saw it like with the title of your talk on the schedule." Mm-hmm. And I was so mystified that I walked in and just started, and I sat in for a little bit of your talk, and I ended up watching the whole thing, and you made some very good points, and I really enjoyed it, and I thought it was very, very interesting. So, like it's not like you can't it's not like there's you can bridge the divide easily.
Of course you can. We know that. That's why we're having this conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm really feeling like this conversation is going to take clearly a psychological tone. We're looking at the psyche of Homo sapiens sapien and how we're still tend to be, bless our hearts, so egocentric. Because I really think it can be as simple as that and yet complex. And I'm thinking of something else, Mike, in terms of this clear demarcation and in terms of attitude. And, as you described this incident, you said it was at the Congress, at UFO Congress,
Yep.
several years ago. And I know that they've got the cornucopia of topics within the field of ufology there. But how clear it was that once certain people realized what you'd be talking about, they didn't want to talk to you. And then the love and lighters I like that love and light, nuts and bolts. I'm going to remember that. I'm going to steal that one from you.
Go ahead. I stole it from someone else. So, yeah.
But one of the things I'm thinking about, as you know, I did a talk last year in Australia where I was trying to make some semblance of a case for contact as a mass phenomenon. Unconscious contact is what I called it. But one of the areas that I wanted to really kind of exploit, to really shine a light on, were those, this isn't necessarily the same thing, but still the conservatives, even the skeptics of the whole phenomenon for that matter. But even as I listened to you, I'm wondering, at least in some cases, I mean, look, I say that anyone that is involved more than just a notion in this field, I don't care what aspect, there's some skin in the game that they've got, maybe even their own experience. This is one of the things I brought out in my talk, that even in this vehement skepticism may be a form of denial of personal experience. Do you know what I'm saying?
Sure.
I think there's something very interesting about the vehemence of the, oh no, it's a scientific study and that's it. It's all about the materialistic aspects. In that vehemence, could there be a bit of denial, almost like your own, in a sense, in the begining? You didn't want to see it. Talk about that.
Absolutely.
Elaborate.
I mean, that's tough to say, but I mean, one of the things that I ask is, a lot of people get into this subject. Even the nuts and bolts crowd get into it from a sighting or something like that. And then there's the mystery of the UFO contact. If it's what it seems to be, it has the ability to completely erase its own presence. So
I'll elaborate on that when you say erase its own presence.
Well, so I did a little essay some years ago, and there was a researcher. She was a MUFON state director for the state of Utah, and her name was Elaine Douglas. She has since passed, and she was a tough one. She was not a love and lighter. I mean, she was a tough cookie, and she would ask people. She did straight up kind of MUFON type investigations. Mm-hmm. And then part of her little thing was, she said, after the MUFON paperwork was filled out, I'd sit with a person and say, just here, let's talk for a little bit. What's the strangest thing that ever happened to you? What's gone on in your life? And she said, you knew right away whether they had UFO contact or not. You asked that question. What's the weirdest thing that ever happened to you? And you'll know. And so she kind of realized that these people were telling exactly the stories that people who had UFO contact would tell, without the direct memory of having been abducted. So her estimation was that over 50% of the people who see a UFO are actually abductees. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was pretty provocative. So I went around and talked to other UFO investigators, and it's certainly not all of them, but Bud Hopkins, who's since passed, also certainly thought that. David Jacobs certainly thinks that. Yvonne gave a very nuanced answer to that question. And so what you ended up, the more cautious investigators would say, well, it depends on the UFO sighting. Mm-hmm. And the more unambiguous the UFO sighting, the more likely the person would be. This is all just people's opinion. The more likely they would be to be have had direct contact
Right.
experiences.
I'd like to, if I could just interject, Mike, I want to add to that. That kind of raised an eyebrow of recognition when you mentioned this woman making that assessment. I don't know if you're familiar with the excellent work of Steve Mera, who's a UFO and paranormal investigator over in the UK, who recently gave me some stats, of which I'm still trying to understand where they were derived from, but having to do with the witnessing of a UFO, the witnessing of a craft, over a certain period of time may intimate contact. His numbers come up if you have a sighting that lasts in excess 8 minutes or more, a sighting. It could very well have been more than just a sighting, when a sighting is not just a sighting.
Sure.
And there were a couple of other numbers associated with that, but that's pretty provocative on its own.
Yeah, and I would also
sighting.
say anyone who they say if you have car trouble, if you're in a car,
Oh,
and the
sure,
car,
very common. Absolutely.
yeah, so that would put you more in that list, which is, I mean, you cannot prove this. You would have to have a ton of money to figure out a way to study this scientifically. But this is just, the opinion of researchers who've put a lot of time and effort into this, and so yeah, so back to the folks at the UFO conference. My sense is, like, if you've made it to the UFO conference, something's going on in your life.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That's like going to the Alcoholics Anonymous meeting and saying, "Oh, I don't have a drinking problem, but I'm sitting here in this circle." Like, you're there for a reason.
Right. Absolutely. Well, in terms of proving, I think we need to take that word out of our vernacular when it comes to this field. I don't care what side of it you're on, because proof as we believe it to be, or proof as we understand it to be, I think we're playing with a different deck of cards here altogether. The
Exactly.
multifacets of this phenomenon, both from the mechanistic and the experiential, is
well. And I'll say that, like, for me, like, this is not, like, I am not an impartial investigator, right? I am not objective. Right? I'm not objective. This is selfish. I want answers for myself. I had a bunch of owl experiences. I want answers to what the owl thing means. More questions are arising than answers, that's for sure. But so I'm entering this completely subjectively.
right. You have
And
to.
so,
I think
not if you're researching,
yeah.
the health effects of, vitamin C. You don't have to be. You have to be somewhat objective. But so I'm not. So here's a funny story. A friend of mine called me up. He was angry. He was a little annoyed at me, and I was doing a lot of. He's a great researcher too. I don't want to use his name here but he gets sort of annoyed at me. And he says, "Mike, your research, your stuff you're just driving me crazy. Your research is not scientific." And without skipping a beat, I said, "What do I care? I'm not a scientist."
There you go. Right.
Which is true, right? I mean, you don't have to have a scientific bend to be a journalist.
Right.
You don't have to have a scientific bend to be a good listener.
Right. That's absolutely true. No, yours is a different brand of investigation. But I'll say this for the record, too, and I'm trying to remember who it was that said this, that had a comment about the way the field of science approaches its own experiments. And I'm going to think of this person, but the person said that science will finally get some answers when they start to when the scientists themselves start to become a part of the experiment. That would be the experiential. So maybe we need to re-examine and reframe the way we look at science or approach certain experiences. Experiments, I meant to say, experiments. By becoming, let's go back to the work of Einstein and others. Newton, who was a mystic, Sir Isaac Newton himself. Einstein, now I know his experiments, some of the more sophisticated ones were certainly not predicated on his dream state, but we know that the dreams had a lot to do with how he approached the criteria of what the information that he got. I think some of the best scientists understand the experiential is important, but it can't be all one thing or all another, just like this isn't all love and light and it's not all nuts and bolts. This is what this conversation is about, bridging the two.
Yeah, and I'm in my research, like, I'm trying to be very formal in the way I present my research, but I'm totally open to presenting the stuff that's pretty far out.
Mm-hmm.
Here's an example. Okay, so this woman, Jessica, she gets a hold of me and she tells me an owl story. She said she's lying in bed, she looks out the window and there's an owl, and it's on the branch, and it's looking down at her, and she's looking up at the owl, and this blue beam comes down and hits the owl in the head, and then this beam shoots out of the owl's third eye and connects with her third eye, this beam, like this laser beam, and she's basically downloaded with this mystical knowing of everything in the universe. And I was like, wait, were you asleep? Was this a dream? She's like, no, this was not a dream. And she then, I went through the questions, and she had a very close-up UFO sighting as a young woman. I think she was in elementary school, so she would have been a girl. But and a bunch of psychic premonitions and such. So I kind of put that on the back shelf. I'm like, wow, that's a powerful story. I don't know what to make of it. That one story, I can't go into it now. Her story somehow got intertwined with another set of stories that had so many synchronicities connected to them that I trusted her story because it was connected to this divergent web of synchronicities. And that's not science. That's me. And I say it straight up in the book. Like, I don't hide the fact that I'm making my connections using the power of synchronicity.
I want to bring something up. I'm taking somewhat copious notes right now. I'm trying not to have the pen, my writing, be picked up on the microphone, but very interesting what you just said, Mike, in terms of how it seemed that the owl was used almost as a catalyst between whatever was coming from, let's just say out there broadly, through the owl into the third eye of the witness or the experiencer. So my question becomes, have you looked at, and again, no answer to whatever extent is going to be simple, but could the owl act as some sort of an interface or catalyst between extra dimensions in our own 3D? There's something absolutely, it's almost as if they're translating something maybe.
That's the lore. Absolutely. That's the mythology, right? So let's turn the clock back a few hundred years, and you're like out in the plains of, South Dakota, right? And you are walking down the path in your moccasins, right? And you have this mystical experience with an owl, right? Whatever it might be. So you have a mystical, powerful interaction with an owl. Then you go in, find the teepee at the edge of the village where the shaman lives, and you sit with him and say, I had this experience with the owl. The shaman, in that context, would be well-versed and ask questions like, what were you doing in your life? What were you thinking about at the moment? What's changed since you saw the owl? So absolutely, like that, they would say the owl is a totem spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm using sort of like, bad TV mumbo jumbo here, but sort of saying like, you have been imbued with the owl magic, right? So absolutely, yes, the owl can be the intermediary between the worlds. Now that is that's the role, right? So that's the core myth of the owl. So the owl is a night totem. The owl is a bird that flies at night, which is remarkable. Even an ancient man would have recognized that it is remarkable the owl can fly through the forest at night. Right? We live in a world with electric light bulbs. Think of what, just a few hundred years ago, what it must have been before the electric light, what night must have meant. Night was eerie and sinister. All that's changed since we have car headlights and flashlights and street lights and lights in our house. Now, the owl in all the worlds, this is a rough simplification. The owl flying into the darkness becomes a metaphor for flying into other realms. Mm-hmm. Now, not only does it fly to the other realms, it has to come back. It has to return, and it will return with a message from the gods, a message from your ancestor, a message from the land of the dead. And now this has just simply been updated. They're the intermediary between us and the UFO occupants, right? The UFO occupants are on the same plane as the dead and the gods and the ancient ancestors, let's say. So that would be that's the central thesis of my argument about the owls. Yeah, they're
I
And
had
then
not
what was
heard that,
happening,
but yeah.
yeah, what's happening is that people are they're straight up in their stories, like without me telling it at all. They're saying, well, I was, here, I'll give you a real quick one. So this actually, there's more to this story, but I've heard this story over and over again in many forms. A woman, her friend of my sister's, her mother died, excuse me, her father had died, and she was grieving the loss of her father. And there was a little nature walk in the neighborhood that went through the woods right outside the neighborhood where my sister lives. This woman lives right across the street from my sister. So I've walked these same little nature walks. And she was grieving the loss of her father. And every day she would pass this owl. She'd pass this owl, and she's grieving, and she's like basically seeking to move past the grief. And then finally she looks at this owl after this has been going out day after day, and she says, owls shouldn't be out during the day. And she looks at this owl and says, Daddy? And in that moment, she's completely filled with this. I'm getting chills just saying this. In that moment, she's completely filled with a sense of knowing that her father is fine. Everything is all right. And the owl flies off, and she never sees it again. And her grieving ended. And when she told me this story the same day my mother died, this woman across the street from my sister's house. And she said, the way she presented the story was, she did not know anything about my owl research. She said, I know there's an afterlife, and I know because of an experience with an owl. Now, so yes, we have this intermediary, it plays an intermediary role. It's a messenger. She called the owl a messenger without any prompting from me, and that happened so often that it became the name of the book.
I'm looking at it right now. They are the messengers. How do we go from the extraordinarily mystical to the extraordinarily mechanical? How do we reconcile these two things? I'm going to bring it right back. We're in an age where we're talking about, I know this seems like it's like the antithesis or sacrilege having these two conversations in one, but there's something here. We're starting to get what I'm calling this slow drip of mainstream media coverage about the revelation that UFOs have been studied within high-level government intelligence circles. You've got the Stars Academy or TTSA. You've got the Pentagon's ATIP, the still discussed Wilson leaked documents, etc. All this stuff. And there's serious erudite researchers whose work remains centered on this aspect, the mechanistic, not the mystical. But there are some, very few, like our mutual friend and colleague. Who am I talking about? Can you guess?
Grant Cameron.
Of course you are. Of course we are. We're talking about Grant, who, let's just say, has straddled beautifully both sides of the fence in terms of his research. He, as you know, he's been all over this, the Wilson papers. In fact, I was talking to him. We were both over in the UK for the recent conference and sat on curbside, and he's just telling me so much about this, and he's so passionate about this. But he is equally passionate about the consciousness and experiencer aspect. So perhaps his work in both these areas may help us to get there, to synthesize the phenomenon in terms of our interest level a bit more. What do you think? Is Grant making a dent in that regard of bridging these two things?
Sure. Oh yeah. It's funny. I can talk very, very fast. And I did an interview with Grant on his show.
That's right. You both talk fast, actually.
And it was funny because I was like, right at the beginning, I was like, Grant, we both talk fast. Let's give your listeners 2 shows in one. Let's do 2 hours worth of talk in 1 hour. And he's like, great, we can do that. And then we were totally went at it. And it was really fun. I don't think every show should be like that, but that was fun. Yes. So here's my take on this. So I, for a long time, worked teaching outdoor skills. I would do 30-day trips into the mountains in Alaska and Canada and the Rockies, and you would have young people, usually college age, and you get really close with the folks, and you spend time out there, and then you just sit with them. And there was part of our job is to really sit with them and listen. And what do you need? And they'd often say, this is a story that came up over and over again. It's like, my parents don't understand me. Like they just don't understand me. I need my parents to change. And I was like an adult, so I was in my 40s, and I was like, you're probably not going to change your parents. Like, don't make that your goal. All you can do is be your best self. And your parents are either going to recognize that or they're not. But you, for your own sake, need to be your own best self. And I gave that talk many times in one form or another. So let's take this one form of like it's not my job to change the attitude of the nuts and bolts camp.
Of course not.
It's my job to do the very best work I can, and to make it accessible to the to everyone, right? So if my research gets a little too insular, it'll leave people. People won't have a way in, right? So I guess that's what I'm doing for myself. I'm not trying to change anyone. People don't like that. Like, here, you got to change. You got to,
No.
you got to see my point of view. People that doesn't fly.
Yeah.
What I can do is say, I can present my information and do my research at the best level I can, and present it in a way that's accessible to you. And I find it interesting, and maybe you will too. And I can't go much beyond that to try to bridge the divide.
Well, that's well said. Thank you. And I agree. And I think, my mother used to say, particularly when talking about guys, if you think you're going to change him, think again. That's not going to happen. You can't change anyone, nor should you want to. So being the best you, as they say in today's parlance, do you. Just do it well and do you. So that's a good thing. Another thing, I have so many questions about this, and this is not, what we're talking about is not the ultimate thing. I don't care what side of this camp you're on, Mike, we want some answers, however they come. There is the truth that's out there, right? But they're inextricably linked. How can you extract the aliens from the craft and the craft from the aliens, so to speak? And I use those terms loosely. I don't like either one of them, but you can't. And I think that there's some individuals, let's say I'm going to call it the nuts and bolts camp, that are on the inside that may also know that. In fact, it was Grant, I think, and I'm trying to remember who he was talking about here. It could have been the gentleman, the former head of Lockheed Skunk Works, that had some intimation about the consciousness experiential aspect and let somebody know at some level, sort of talking cryptically, that this is a key to the big secret. So in your estimation, some of these people that are in these high-level intelligence circles in government and military, do some of them know and are maybe intent on keeping the focus on the more mechanistic, so that we don't understand where what I like to say the real juice is?
So the remote viewing program.
Yes.
That was the original military remote viewing program.
SRI.
At SRI, out of SRI. That was, I've talked to a couple people involved. Well, I've talked to who was peripherally involved in the early stages of that, which was John Alexander, and I asked him this question. And I also, I didn't ask him this straight up question, but I did ask Jim Mars, and Jacques Vallée has spoken about this. Jim Mars and Jacques Vallée say straight up that everyone involved in the original military remote viewing program, the remote viewers, every one of them had what we would call UFO contact, direct UFO contact. That's a little more than, that's a bold statement, right?
Sure is.
Every one of them. And they knew that, and they discussed that openly. I talked with John Alexander, who is as nuts and bolts as they get, right? He's as pragmatic. And I said, in one of the stories in the books, I asked him, I needed a comment, so I called him up, I played the role of journalist in a way. So I contacted him. Now, in one of the stories, in the stories book, this man who was deeply immersed in remote viewing as a hobby was beginning to have these mystical experiences. And he had a beautiful, powerful experience with an owl that plays out. It's a real story, but it plays out so dreamlike. It plays out like a fairy tale. And I won't go into the story, but he was deer hunting, and everything played out with an owl and the deer basically offered itself up to him. And it's a really beautiful, powerful story. Now, I told that story to John Alexander, Colonel John Alexander.
Did you?
Who's got kind of a dark, some people in this, the Love and Light people just treat him as,
I know. I know.
They treat him as like,
the perception.
The reptilian overlord or something like that. So I told him the story, and he was like, yes, we The question was, does this happen? Did this happen? Did you notice this in the remote viewing program? And he said, yes, we recognized this was an after effect. People would get immersed in remote viewing and they would have profound mystical experiences.
As an after effect, he said.
It's somehow, where does the before and after come sometimes?
Right.
If everyone involved in the UFO in the remote viewing program in those early stages was a UFO abductee, then where does beginning and end?
I would argue in the very beginning. I mean, let's take Ingo Swann. Speaking of SRI, he was very much involved, along with Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff, as we know, Paul Smith, who I know quite well. And I don't know if you've read the late Ingo Swann now, his book Penetration, which is amazing, folks. If you have a chance, if you can get your hands on it, it's hard to find now.
You can get it as an audiobook on Audible.
Well, there you go. I still like the paper version, so I can take my copious notes in the margins. And this is a book in which you would. Now, I bring that up because, as you know, a big part of this book, Penetration, was his sojourns to remote viewing sojourns to the moon. The incredibly mysterious relationship he had with this Mr. Help me, what was his name? Axelrod, and the so-called aliens that he was interacting with, one of which was in a grocery store in Los Angeles. I mean, come on now. This was an integral part of what this book was about. SRI, remote viewer. So there you go. That's just one example.
Exactly. Okay. Exactly. So this is the, what's at the core, right? I mean, what the UFO contact thing is so like knotted up in this tapestry of other stuff, of this mystical stuff, this psychic stuff, this remote viewing stuff, the weird stories of seeing aliens at the grocery store. Yeah.
They know it. The they being those on that side of the camp, the nuts and bolts camp. They know, at least those that are on the inside that are working in this regard. What is his name? Kevin Day. What's his name? I shouldn't say it like that. Retired Navy radar specialist Kevin Day. I don't know if you're familiar with the name that's come up. He's been in the news. Kevin Day, as I said, Navy radar specialist who's been very outspoken about his involvement in witnessing this now famous Tic Tac UFO back in 2004 in San Diego. Okay. So while on duty, he observed a multitude of objects at extremely high altitude doing inexplicable things. Okay, we know that. We're going to leave the details for now. But here's the bottom line. Though I don't think this aspect is discussed as much, he's also reported to have had some strange experiences that accompanied what he'd been witnessing. And as a result, some people have called his psychological state into question. I think he had been diagnosed with PTSD. And he said, no, man, I had an experience here. Here we go again with this very, sort of sobering report, the Tic Tac UFO, radar specialist Kevin Day being a key witness, but having experiences going along with it.
There you go. I mean, this is if you're the UFO investigator, right? So you could go, and it's totally prudent and correct to ask the questions. What time of day was it? What day of the week was it? What direction was it traveling? Can you draw a picture of it? Mm-hmm. And then you got to take your UFO investigator hat off and ask the radar operator, what was going on in your life before? How has your life changed? Have you had any psychic experiences? How has your spirituality changed? Have you had an upswing in synchronicity? I mean, these are the questions I ask, and I'm astonished at the answers I get.
Mm-hmm. And yet you're not, because you wouldn't be asking the question. You knew what the answer would probably be.
Well, let me say, I used to be astonished. Now I sort of expect the answers, and I'm trying to make sense of what that might mean.
Right.
But the best I can say is that, people who've had close-up UFO sightings, and I'll go one step further. We don't have time now. I could have some wonderful stories, but people who have had powerful owl experiences, I'll ask the same questions. What was going on in your life? What changed after? How has your spirituality changed? How has your psychic abilities changed? Has there been an upswing in synchronicities? They will answer the questions the same as the UFO experiencer. So will the near-death experiencer.
Well, now we're getting into what FREE, as well as Grant Cameron for that matter, but Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial and Extraordinary Experiences, led by Ray Hernandez and company. This is the first scientific study, apparently, of the experiencer aspect and what they call the cross contact modalities, NDEs, shamanic experiences, UFO experiences, abductions, etc., are all inextricably linked in some way.
Yes, Ray. Have you interviewed Ray? You must have.
I know Ray well. He's been on the show several times. Yes, I have.
Yes. Did he tell the story about like driving in traffic in Miami
Yeah,
and
that's
seeing
the
the
big
big wheel?
story,
Oh
right?
my gosh. Yeah,
Absolutely. That's how he got the contact modalities. Yes, we know the
it
story
came through a
well.
download. Yeah.
And by the way, folks, we do have that on our YouTube channel. Maybe I'll put a link in the description so you can go to it. It's a great story. Absolutely. And of course, not his, but the free organization put out Beyond UFOs is quite the Bible in that and more. And this is a scientific approach to the experiential part of this big phenomenon. It was the late Stanton Friedman, who said when he was asked to define ufology, he said the scientific study of UFOs. But then he went on to say, I think it's probably a lot broader than that.
And here's someone who's, and I talked with him, and he took me aside and said, here's the owl story that I heard in this case, and this was thought to be an owl in this case. And so, so he has heard my talk several times, or he did hear my talk several times at these small conferences. Actually, I think he was at the Experiencer Speak conference, and he was in the room listening to my talk, and he came up
when
to me
we were there
afterwards.
together.
I don't know if I talked that year,
Okay,
but I think it was the year before I talked. Yeah.
Okay.
I can't remember. I think it was 2015 I talked. I can't remember now. But yes, so he's certainly on the nuts and bolts camp.
Absolutely.
Though he is absolutely open to the consciousness aspect of what's going on.
I think that's brilliant. I'm so sad he's gone. Still hard to get your arms around that he's gone.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he said he'd never, as far as he could recall, had never seen a UFO. I don't know about that.
That's not true. He did see one in probably.
He must have recalled it because
eight or so years ago, he probably saw one because he did a little like YouTube video where he said, I had never saw. He said I never saw one, and this time I saw one, and he described it, and it was a typical little dot in the sky that was making unusual maneuvers, but he saw a UFO.
I think we started by stopping using these shortcuts, UFO, UAP, ET. I can't stand them. I mean, how can we even call this a field of ufology in the broadest sense?
I never do. I don't think I ever use the term.
Yeah, I do. I'm guilty of it. I'm going to find something else. We're going to come up.
I use alien and abduction all the time.
Yeah. Words can be so misleading, and yet we know broadly what we're talking about. Well, listen, we're winding down. I knew this was going to go fast. This can just go on, and as it should. And I'm going to say to the journeyers, have this conversation among yourself. What's important to you? Is it the experiential? Is it the mechanistic? Is it a synthesis of both? Are we going to get to the bottom of this? So many questions. So many. Forgive me, I'm going to clear my throat here. I want to end by quoting from, I think Miguel Mendonça as well, who wrote the excellent book, We Are the Disclosure, of which both I, as well as Stanton Friedman and Jim Mars and everybody, Barbara Lamb, wonderful individuals were interviewed for this book. But he said, in terms of sort of approaching this question of, is it this or that? He says one of the big inspirations for his writing this book was, quote, the bigger picture I became aware of during the research for the Hybrid Project. He also co-authored the book Meet the Hybrids with Barbara Lamb. He goes on to say, I learned that the field that many call, quote, ufology is a far richer, more extensive subject than is generally understood. It does not stop with classifying the craft and profiling the various types of beings, but takes us on into a deeper understanding of the nature and structure of reality and of the self. As such, it has no boundaries and is therefore almost impossible to define. So it requires a group effort on a global scale to collect the many pieces of the picture and holistic thinkers to help assemble them, end quote. And I think indeed, I'm going to say indeed, there are many, many pieces to this complex puzzle. And you're integral in helping us put those pieces together, Mike Clelland. I appreciate you for that. Tell us what else you got going on, because I know we didn't talk about hidden experience, did we? Talk about that a little bit. Yeah.
So on my desk here, I got my third book, which is it has owls on the cover. The word owl is on the cover. Here, let me just grab it here. I've got a copy of it right here. Oops, I'm gonna reach.
And mine is on the way, and I can't wait. Go check it out, Journeyers. We'll make sure to have a link to the Amazon where you can get this book. He's going to talk about that.
Okay, so it's the title is Hidden Experience, which is the name of my blog, and this is collected writings from 10 years of blogging, from 2009 to 2019. This just got published a month ago. A
Congrats.
Personal Journey of Owls, Synchronicity, and UFO Contact. And this book, what happened is Richard Dolan said, you need to write a memoir. You need to write a first person memoir.
He's a big influence on you, isn't he?
Well,
Dolan.
yeah, and I feel like I'm a small influence on him too. So, but
I'm sure.
and I realized like I can't write a memoir because I was writing it real time in the blog. Like this blog was I was like, I'm going to say it straight up. I don't hide it in the text at all. I was teetering on the edge of like a nervous breakdown. The stuff was so challenging to make sense of. And I was journaling and writing on the blog as it was happening. And at the same time, I was having all kinds of overt paranormal experiences. Some of them certainly play out like direct UFO contact. And I was writing about them. So instead of writing a memoir where I would have said, now that I look back 10 years, I'll tell this story of something that, and instead it was like, if you go to the original manuscript in the blog, it says, this happened last night. I am freaking out. And a handful of posts begin like that. So I wrote it, or I took the existing blog posts and I had to clean them up a little bit to make them a little more readable for a book format. But yeah, so it's a real time, first person set of memories on my own journey on what it meant for me to come to terms with the direct contact experience.
I thank you so much on behalf of, I know so many out there that may not be at the point where they can openly talk about their experiences. This is tough stuff. And it's revelatory. It can be scary. It can be certainly writing the blog and now the book cathartic. What a journey. Man, you are on the higher journey, I got to tell you. And I thank you for it. Well, journeyers, as you can tell, I call my audience the journeyers because they're all on a higher journey as well. But to the journeyers, if you enjoyed this episode, I hope you did. I certainly did. And particularly if you know someone that might resonate with some of what you heard us talk about today, I urge you, please, to like and share this content with your circle of friends and family. And of course, if you enjoy the shows here at Higher Journeys, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. We got brand new shows each and every week. And by the way, I think our friend, Mr. Dolan, will be one of them coming up real soon. So stay tuned for that. And maybe shortly thereafter, you'll come back. Would you?
I certainly would. And I just heads up, I did drink a really strong cup of coffee right at the beginning of this talk. So I was in full force there.
You were in, I loved it. I can't wait to go produce this so I can listen to all the great stuff we talked about. Lots of, I like to call some of these shows cliffhangers because there's just so much more to this story. Continued great research on your part with these owls. Do you think we'll ever get an answer to what they are? I know that's a loaded question at the end of the show, but
so the answer is no. But what we can get is a deeper sort of mystical understanding.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's like saying, will we ever get an answer to what is God? Right? Like, no, we're never going to make everyone happy. But that's not my job, is to give people answers. I'm an artist. Like I want to address this stuff poetically. I want to just, so the content of my books are story after story after story of sometimes my own experiences, oftentimes other people's experiences. But and in reading these stories, you come to a deeper conclusion. You sort of bypass the logical mind. You leapfrog right across the logical mind, and these stories are imbued with this deeper mystical truth.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Hey, go out and get Mike's 3 books. I'm going to pick them up right here. I love them. Nice covers,
you're
too.
Going to hurt yourself picking up all 3. Yeah, so
we got the Messengers.
To pick up all 3.
Yeah, absolutely. The Messengers, Owls, Synchronicity, and the UFO Abductee. And then a companion to the Messengers is Stories from the Messengers, accounts of owls, UFOs, and a deeper reality. And I might add, you got some great content on our friends at YouTube. Specifically, I believe it was the Ozark Mountain UFO conference.
That was a good talk. Yeah,
that was a good talk. I'd urge everyone to go over and watch that. It was great stuff. Well, thank you, sir. You are doing your thing, and we appreciate you for it. And again, I hope you will come back and join us one of these days.
I certainly will. Anytime.
Great. And thank you, Journeyers. As always, we appreciate you for tuning in to Higher Journeys. We'll talk to you real soon. Take care.